And I don't blame the victims. It's a lot of denial because, you know, for someone to accept that like this was domestic violence or this is domestic violence or this is physical abuse also means accepting their own decision that I'm choosing to be with someone who is doing this to me. So it's very difficult. I don't blame the people who are victims or survivors. The names are, I use them interchangeably because victim is still used in the legal world. Survivor is more used socially now and stuff like that. And so I don't blame them for having a hard time accepting it because they, you know, our society is one that puts a lot of blame on the victim. There's a victim blaming in our society, right? A lot of, even police officers, even now, even in court, even state's attorneys, even in criminal cases, even judges, you know, I've heard them say, but why didn't you leave then? Why didn't you call the police then, you know? And it's interesting when you mentioned BIPOC communities and South Asians, for example. I've had Muslim female clients or Black female clients that have said, I have not called the police on my significant other or my partner when there was abuse because I don't trust what the police will do to my Black boyfriend, which understandable. But to have to make that decision in the first place, right? To have to, one, while you're in the situation, which is very difficult and, you know, people are not fully themselves, you end up losing yourself as when you're a victim of psychological abuse. But then even during that very vulnerable, terrible state, they have to like make these decisions because of our societal issues. Like that's insane, right? And they do. And for a lot of people, that's why they're not calling the police, you know? They're like, okay, yeah, he's abusing me, but I don't want him dead either. Like he's still, you know, my child's parent, or he's still someone I've cared about in the past or whatever it may be. So they just don't trust the police or the system. I've had Muslim clients tell me, you know, I'm scared to tell non-Muslim people about this abusive relationship because they're gonna think that just because he's a Muslim man, now he's gonna make Muslims look bad, you know? I'm like, that sucks that we have to think about that, you know? Think about the stereotype of the abused Muslim woman and the abuser of a Muslim man, which is like a terrible stereotype, but people also don't wanna feed it, but you're also caught in a conundrum oftentimes because of that, right? So.
Because when it comes to Muslims, for example, there's this Western narrative of women being oppressed, men being abusive. So I want to say it makes sense when a Muslim woman might withhold her reporting that she's being abused. And we just need to do better as a society to be able to allow these victims to come out. And I'm not saying anything is flawed in the logic of withholding that they are being abused, but I can see why someone who is being abused, whether they're Muslim, whether they're non-Muslim, whether they're, you know, a member of the Black community or another minority or marginalized group, that they don't want to feed into these narrative that, you know, their women behave a certain way, their men are abusive and violent. I can see why you know, a victim may withhold that to prevent those stereotypes from being proven as true in the court of public opinion.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's one of the many barriers to reporting, right? So people don't expose. You know, I didn't realize how common this was in our communities until I started doing this work, because people hear about like a Muslim attorney who deals with this stuff and they want to go to a Muslim person because they want someone to not project those stereotypes on them, right? Or have their opinion on Islam change, but also who understands, like, I mean, for divorce cases, mahar, for example, child support, custody, like all the Islamic parts of this, right? So people will reach out to me, and there were some, like 2020, you know, and 2021, for example, there were these years, it was like once a week that I was getting reached out to by somebody, either a friend's sibling, a friend's parent, a friend's friend, right? And people would just find my name and like reach out being like, I need help, right? And I didn't realize how prevalent it was in our community until I started being the person that people talk to about this, right? And we have these stereotypes that we have an image of a abused person in our heads, right? Which is like someone who is like maybe an immigrant, maybe doesn't know English, maybe is less educated, maybe is more naive or vulnerable that way. And that's like not the case, right? There are people who there are times where I've been talking to someone and I'm like, I'm just like you. Like I cannot, I'm like, I see myself in them, I see them in me, and I'm just like, what is like the difference? Like, what are the chances that they ended up in this situation, right? And it's because abuse is very manipulative, right? It's very, it's done very methodically. People know what they're doing oftentimes, and if they don't intend on it outright, eventually it becomes negligence. Like it becomes like, okay, I'm aware of the effects, but I'm not doing anything to change it, right? I didn't intend for it to be this bad, but now I've seen that it has gotten bad, right? But I'm not doing anything to change it. So it's interesting because I think, yeah, because of that, a lot of people are just like stuck in these situations and in these cycles of abuse. But yeah, there are so many people. We don't realize how prevalent it is in all of the communities. And people always say it's worse. Like my Muslim friends will say it's worse in the Muslim community. My, Latinx friends will say it's worse in that community. Like having worked with a lot of communities, it's literally the same. Like I always say, like, it's not a Muslim problem. Everyone's like, oh, well, Desis, we have a lot of that, right? Yes, if we're in the Desi community, we see it more in the Desi community, right? But when I was working in Kane County, where it's all white and Latinx people, all my cases were white and Latinx, and it happens in those communities just as much. I had just as many clients. There's just as many problems. There is a difference in the tools that are used to abuse, like alcoholism and versus like immigration status, like so depending on the different communities. So there are differences in what tools abusers use in order to exercise power and control. But the fact that abuse is happening is the same all across the board, unfortunately.
Probably someone who isn't as exposed to abuse or dealing with clients that are victims of abuse, maybe to them it sounds, very frightening upfront, as it should. It, can startle anybody hearing this story or this abuse has been going on. But for you, because, this is essentially your day job, and, you deal with clients that are consistently, maybe it's a long-term abuse, maybe it's short-term abuse, because you've been facing this for, you said 10 years now?
Mm-hmm. Almost 10 years.
Almost 10 years. So it's just like, I almost imagine you just maybe in the beginning just trying to take it all in and being very moved by a lot of these stories. And not saying that you don't get moved by them now, but more so that it's like, okay, I'm literally in the world of where all this is happening. Mm-hmm. So to me, a crazy story, what may be a crazy abuse story to me might just be a regular day for you.
Yeah, maybe. That's a good distinction too between like whether it still phases me the same, but my expression of it might be different. So in the beginning, actually this is interesting that you brought this up because I didn't think about this before. But in the beginning of my career, my impression was I have to not show any emotion. I have to not show any care. I have to put all that aside because they're the ones who get to feel anything and I don't. I have to be strong. It's like this, it's a misconception, I think. Now, it does faze me, and I do care. And oftentimes when they tell me how something was done to them, my expression of it is like, oh God, and I do take a pause sometimes, or I do take a break sometimes, or I have like a sigh or an exhale or something that just shows the impact it's having on me. And I think, evolved to realize that it's okay to show that kind of emotion to your client because then it's almost validating of their emotion, right? And if I was telling someone something horrific that happened to me, I wouldn't want them to just be like stone cold, still-faced, because it's weird to be giving so much and have no feedback, and body language, tone, expressions, like all of that goes a long way. So if I felt like someone was hearing me and was impacted by what I was saying, but not judging me for it, I think that would be more inviting and help me trust them more. And so even with my clients, I do kind of like give a little bit of feedback, but when they're telling me something that they did, a lot of times, my clients feel shame at being in a place of, in that situation to begin with. My clients feel shame at dating somebody who is doing this to them to begin with, understandably, but I don't want them to feel shame, right? It's not their fault, but we have a victim blaming culture in our society. And so a lot of people will blame themselves as well. And so when they say things that they did themselves, or like, yeah, if I did go over to their place, or I did go back to this relationship after this incident, I'm like, okay, that's where I don't show much of like, oh my God, how could you? Like, I'm not going to do that because I understand the complexity and the intricacies that are involved with these type of relationships, and how, you know, the psychological abuse that happens and the impact of that being that it makes it hard for the victim to leave, for example. So I'm not going to show so much of a reaction there as I would if something's happening to them, for example. So that took me a long time to learn, and I'm still learning it. And it's one of those things that people kind of, as a service provider is in their field, I'm sure that I'm not the only one. I'm sure nurses, doctors, psychologists are all kind of, they have their own process of how to go about that. But yeah, it is an interesting, like, you know, it's kind of trippy to think about it.
And you were mentioning earlier about the patriarchal structure of abuse, and I'm pretty sure that, you know, not even being an expert in abuse or in the field, that majority of the victims are women. But are there male victims that you do encounter, or what's the kind of ratio that maybe you see, or maybe there's a statistic nationally of this percentage of abuse victims are women, this is the percentage of men?
Mm-hmm. It is like mostly women, like mostly women who are the victims of abuse. And it's because in our society, we have an innate power dynamic where men have more power than women. And that's, you know, evidenced by our like wages and a bunch of other history, just all of it. And so women are primarily the victims, but I've had male clients who are being victimized by a like a female identifying person, and I've had male identifying clients who have been victimized by another male identifying. So in a gay relationship, for example, and there have been women who are victimized by male or female as well. There's also not just intimate partner violence. There can be violence, like domestic violence encompasses all household members. It could be siblings to sibling, parent to child, child to parent. I've seen all of those situations as well. They've been very sad to see, very eye-opening, and it definitely does happen.